This morning, the CDC is reporting that suicide has overtaken traffic accidents as the nation's leading cause of injury-related death. Suicides by military personnel also reaching all-time highs. Dr. Joshua Weiner joins us this morning with more on the problem and how to prevent suicides. This is a tough subject to talk about because nobody wants to talk about it.
Right.
How many people commit suicides in the United States each year?
Last year, there were about 38,000 people who committed suicide. So that's a large number, but what's even larger is that it's estimated that 1 million people every year in the United States attempt suicide.
How do those rates compare to other countries?
They're about the same as in Australia and Canada, but it's actually lower than in countries like Russia, Japan, and Korea. In Russia, the suicide rate is about 5 times what it is here in the United States.
Is there any reason for those differences? Is there anything going on in those countries that make people more suicidal than here in the United States?
Well, I think that there's probably some economic issues related to that, but also cultural aspects in the countries, because certain cultures, it's not as unacceptable to make a suicide attempt or to commit suicide. There's also religion has something to play. So in some of the Arab countries, the suicide rates are a lot lower than here in the United States.
How do the rates vary based on age and gender?
Well, so men are much more likely to successfully complete a suicide. So the suicide rate for men is about 4 times that of women, but women are 3 times as likely as men to attempt suicide. And as far as age is concerned, the peak time for men or all people to make a suicide attempt and complete suicide is between ages 40 and 60.
But you and I were speaking in the commercial break. It's also turning up in teenagers. Why do you see so many teenagers contemplating suicides?
It's really interesting. The number of teens that think about suicide each year, according to the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which is a CDC study, is 20%. So 20% of teenagers in any given year will seriously consider suicide. 5% will actually make a suicide attempt, and 2% will have such a serious suicide attempt that it will land them in the hospital and they will require treatment. I think it has to do with the difficulties of being a teenager. The rates of suicide attempts in this country for teens has gone up 200% since the 1950s. And I also think it just has to do with the fact that teenagers are very impulsive, and suicide in many cases is an impulsive act. A lot of people are depressed when they make a suicide attempt, but not everybody is depressed. And a study in Austria actually showed that on average, people thought about suicide for 10 minutes before making a suicide attempt.
And I guess this is an overly broad question. I'm sure it's one you've been asked a lot. But what do you think is the biggest reason people even think about taking their own life? Because once you take it, you don't get it back.
I think that people, when they get depressed, their brain becomes so altered that they just don't see any hope. They are really thinking to themselves, suicide makes sense in the moment. I have talked to dozens of people who have made very serious suicide attempts and who have survived. And many times, in fact, the vast majority of times, a day, 2 days later, they say, I can't believe what I did. I can't believe I was thinking that that made sense in the moment.
What signs should you look for in a loved one, and how do you encourage people to prevent suicide?
So what you want to do is you obviously want to be very careful if somebody is expressing any suicidal thoughts. You want to take that very seriously. You don't want to give a glib response like, come on, don't be serious about that. You would never do something like that. Life's too valuable. When people are saying something about it, you need to question them about it. You want to actually talk about suicide, because talking about it actually decreases the likelihood that people are going to attempt it. And you want to find out whether somebody has a plan, because there's a difference between thinking about it and actually taking the next step, which is planning what you might do. You want to get them mental health treatment, and you want to make sure you've removed all medications, pills, guns, any type of weapons that might be in the house. You want to get rid of them, because those are very lethal, and people in that little moment, they might make a mistake and do something that of course they can never take back.
Doctor, definitely a subject no one wants to touch on, but a subject that's very real and a subject we have to find an answer for.
I agree.
Thanks for stopping by.
Thanks, Keith.